Welcome back to another episode of Insects for Fun, the only weekly entomology podcast hosted by a master in entomology. Last week we talked about what may or may not be the heaviest beetle in the world, and this week we're going to talk about the heaviest moth. But before that, an update. My episodes have been a bit inconsistent with their release times recently due to my change in work schedule and added jobs I'm taking over the internet. I still plan to release weekly episodes, but I haven't worked out exactly how to squeeze that in yet. Okay, now let's return back to the broadcast. Endoxyla cinereus, aka the Australian wood moth, is a massive moth in the family Caucidae. Now, I had never actually heard of this family before, but it's apparently pretty big. And we aren't talking about the size of the moths, but those can be pretty big too. These moths are also known as carpenter moths, because the caterpillars bore into trees and feed on wood. There are over 100 genera and over 700 species of moths in the family, and 100 or so of them can be found in Australia. There are wood-boring moths found throughout the world though, and there's a good chance you've encountered some before. Today's focus is entirely on the heaviest of them, and that would be the giant wood moth. This moth is native to Australia and New Zealand and cannot be found anywhere else. In Australia, you can encounter them if you live in Queensland or New South Wales, and you'll know if you see one because they are indeed massive. The moth has a wingspan up to 23 centimeters and weighs 30 grams, which is apparently the weight of an American parakeet. It's not really easy on the eyes though, being mostly gray and often having a bald head. Now, I don't know exactly how they get these bald heads, but it may or may not be due to scalping themselves while crawling out of eucalyptus trees. The moths don't have mouths, just like giant silk moths, and only live a short time to mate and lay eggs. The females are incredibly poor flyers thanks to their size, and they usually just crawl up whatever tree they emerged from and call a male through pheromones. Once she's mated, she will lay thousands of eggs. One source from the Australian Museum said they can lay up to 20,000 in their life. These eggs are very small and can be dispersed by wind to new trees through silken parachutes, in an act called ballooning. In fact, it's currently hypothesized that baby larvae don't actually bore into trees until later in their life cycle. They start out feeding on the roots of eucalyptus trees, and then as they mature and get larger, they can bore into the tree itself and feed on the bark. Little is known about this stage of their life because it hasn't been well documented. The young larvae are only possible to follow if someone raises them from an egg, but as of now, there hasn't really been a person to actually study the life habits of first instar larvae. We know a lot more about the older larvae though because we can see signs that they're in a tree and we can actually find them to study. Younger larvae have dark pink bands on their body that fade with each instar until they become only cream white with red spiracles. The larvae definitely look a bit more on the grubby side compared to your traditional caterpillar. But then again, they are tree borers, so they're not really like a traditional caterpillar at all. Once they get to be 25 millimeters long, that's when they start boring into eucalyptus trees, and they create a small plug made up of silk and sawdust to cover this entrance. The plug doesn't last forever though. As the caterpillar grows over the course of 2 years and gets ready for pupation, it will open up this smaller entrance and make a much larger hole above it between 30 to 40 millimeters in diameter. This larger hole is in preparation for its emergence as an adult moth. And the reason why they open the smaller hole is to drain water when the rainy season comes. The start of the rainy season in summer is actually when these moths emerge from their trees, similar to how Goliath beetles emerge from the ground when the rainy season comes in Africa. At this point, the caterpillars burrow further into the tree, backing themselves into a small corridor and then sealing it off with silk and debris. You'd think that this would protect them from predators, but unfortunately it's not the case. There's of course a parasitoid wasp that has evolved an incredibly long ovipositor to get through all the wood and lay eggs in a prepupal giant wood moth. Another common predator to these large caterpillars would be the yellow-tailed black cockatoos, which excavate the tunnels made by the larvae and eat them out of the tree. Actually, the holes these caterpillars make in trees make really nice homes for other animals such as frogs, lizards, and geckos. This is of course after the moth has emerged from the tree and the home has become vacant. Let's now jump into some interesting cultural facts. So of course my Australian listeners are familiar with the term bush and probably bush tucker as well, but I'm not so sure about my listeners elsewhere. The outback is pretty well known to most people, but forested or uninhabited rural areas in Australia are also referred to as the bush, and bush tucker is food harvested from the bush or the wilderness. To continue on this train of Australian words, large wood-eating caterpillars are referred to as witchetty grubs. The term witchetty is an indigenous term used by people of Arabana descent and refers to the bush. Grubs don't really need an explanation, because we all know what those are. The large larvae of the giant wood moth are packed with proteins and have a nutty flavor when eaten raw. The actual nutritional content is 16 grams of protein per 100 grams, and 28.6 grams of fat per 100 grams. So that would be like 3.5 larvae. The nutritional value remains much the same whether you eat them raw or cook them. If you do cook them though, the skin becomes crispy and the larvae have more of a cooked sausage consistency, with the flavor of peanut prawns, chicken, or scrambled eggs. Wood moths actually compose a large portion of indigenous Australian diets, especially in arid areas. A study on the KTT people of Northern Australia, I hope I said that right, found they're able to collect more than 200 grams of larvae in under an hour. I'm sure once you know what to look for, it becomes relatively easy. And because the moths are so incredibly large, you can bet there will be more in a vicinity where one was found. The knowledge needed to locate them includes their seasonality, host-plant associations, and the subtle bow of trees where larvae are growing. These practices are no longer common but are still surviving in small localized populations of people throughout Australia, both in the north and south. Nowadays, these giant wood-boring caterpillars are seen more as a pest than a food source. And in my most recent bonus episode on Patreon, we talked about another wood-boring insect that, despite being native, is labeled as a pest by people in Australia, and is even being studied as a target for biological control. You might be wondering how something native could be considered problematic enough to be labeled as a pest. But ever since the establishment of eucalyptus plantations for wood pulp in the 1960s, various native insects are being treated as problematic. The wood-boring habits for the large wood moth, for example, can weaken younger trees and even cause them to snap under pressure from strong winds. The bigger problem, though, is the damage done by yellow-tailed black cockatoos, which excavate the larvae and leave even bigger holes in the tree. The thing is that the only biological control known for these moths already exists on the island, so it's not like they can import anything else. Currently, the game plan is to add more understory to farms to help prevent excavation from cockatoos, and use different eucalyptus trees that aren't as susceptible to damage. Thanks for listening to this episode of Insects for Fun, and if you want to support the show and get more content, the best way to do that is to join the Patreon. The more support we get, the more time I can actually dedicate to focus on the show and not be doing jobs on the internet. Links to everything are in the show notes, and if you enjoy the show, do not forget to give this 5 stars on whatever platform you listen. That also goes a very long way. Thanks again for listening, and you'll hear from me again next week.